All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad we're together. Whoever is with us here, and it's always a pleasure to be learning together. This class, as a reminder, is part of our Fall Zman here at Drisha. This is the fifth session of Why Praying Community with Miss Rachael Gelfman Schultz, and I'll turn this to you, Rachael.
Okay, thanks, Evie. Hopefully everyone will figure it out. I see, Amy. Well, the regulars seem to have figured it out, figured out how to get the Zoom link. I have a bit of a cold, so I might need everyone's help. I have my tea. Hopefully, I'll be okay. Okay, so today we're going to talk about, it's our last class. And we're going to talk about the Kriyat Torah, the public Torah reading. And similar to our other sessions, we're going to look at it both from sort of in general, what is the meaning? Why do we do a Torah reading, 3-4 times a week, really? And why does it have to be in community? And through that, to get to the larger questions. But before we started that, I just wanted to wrap up a bit from last week because I felt like we finished quickly and like hear a little bit responses. We had a lot of sources. I thought this week would be fewer sources, but of course, in the end, it ended up also being lots of sources. But so I just wanted to sort of wrap up by hearing from you, and we can also take a look again at the sources of the last couple of sources. So from what we have learned and what you've experienced, like I know that obviously many people in this group, maybe perhaps all have said the mourners Kaddish themselves. Certainly everybody has said the regular Kaddishes themselves. Why do you think that we do it in community? I mean, why does it need to be done in community? Why can't you say it alone or with a partner? Both from last week's class and from sort of personal experience.
Well, I guess you just don't want to feel alone. So this way you're supported by the community. That's kind of like a basic idea, I would assume.
As a mourner, in other words.
As a mourner, yes. So you don't feel like you're alone. There are other people there. They have to respond to your Kaddish. It's a give and take kind of thing. So that to some extent, everybody is acknowledging your loss.
Right. It's a way for both as a mourner, we need it. The mourner needs it. And also it's a way for the community to acknowledge the loss. Okay. So that specifically applies to mourners Kaddish. Does anyone else want to add something about mourners Kaddish or also anything about, Kaddish in general?
Rachael, I'm just curious, does that mean you cannot say it unless you have 10 people?
Yes.
So actually it's prohibited from being said?
Yeah, you're supposed to have 10. Actually, it could be that mourners Kaddish is slightly different. I know. I don't know the details, so I don't want to say it, but I do know that some people who would, I know that according to, I think, the head of Maharat, that people who think that women don't count as a minyan generally would say mourners Kaddish with 10 women. I think the reason is that for mourners Kaddish, it's more about community and less about like the halachic category of minyan. But yeah, in general, you need a minyan for Kaddish.
I've seen it where they actually, if they have 9, they actually open up the ark and call the Torah like number 10.
Right. So that's something that you could do for anything that requires a minyan. And some people say that there are ways to get around for the missing person if necessary.
Okay.
But yeah, but that's the idea. Mourners Kaddish actually, like I said, might be slightly different. But I don't know enough about the ins and outs to say the details. Yeah, Mom.
There is some, I don't know if this is okay halakhically speaking, but there is a version of the Kaddish that you can say without a minyan that I personally have done. I don't know, it just was meaningful to me. I don't know if it's okay legally or not, but
that you said in your home, in other words, when you couldn't get to shul, you're saying.
Yeah, or
Or
there weren't 10 people
if
available.
10 people do not show up, it's a substitute. It's
I
not
see.
the mourner's Kaddish, but it's a substitute.
Very
It's
similar.
a substitute so that you can have that. Yeah, interesting.
Right,
Okay.
yeah.
I've never heard about that, but it sounds interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, you,
I mean, that may
you're
be a
saying you'll
conservative
say it at
idea.
shul when you don't get a minyan. That's what you're saying.
Yeah,
Okay. I have two comments about the actual practice of saying Kaddish in shul, in the Mortis Kaddish in shul in a minyan. So in conservative synagogues, when I've been there, they say that anyone who's saying Kaddish or who has a yurtzeit should stand up, and then everybody else is seated. Whereas in the Orthodox shul, everybody stands for the Kaddish, and the people who are reciting Kaddish recite it. So that's one thing. Then another thing, in my son's yeshiva, they don't have everybody who has to say Kaddish. They have one person say Kaddish, and everyone answers Amen. And it goes around so that, like, if there are 5 people who have to say Kaddish, one person does it the first time, and next person does it the second time. And I asked my son about it. He says, well, it's because you can't answer Amen if there's all these different voices. You have to hear one voice and answer to the one voice. So, so I'm just, it's sort of like a conflict between the emotional need of the support of the community and these little halachic sticklers.
Interesting. That's interesting. I wanted to add though about who stands, that in Sephardi shuls and in most Israeli shuls, it's like in conservative synagogues, that only the mourner stands. In other words, it's a Sephardi thing that only the mourner stands, and because in Israel there's so many Sephardim, it's made its way into other, meaning it's made its way into other shuls also, even non-Sephardi shuls or shuls that are served neither Sephardi, just general neighborhood shuls. So
they don't stand for even when the chazan is reciting Kaddish, it's not the mourner's Kaddish. They don't stand for the Kaddish, like after Chazoras Hashas, when you finish, they don't stand for that Kaddish either.
I don't know what the Sephardi. I don't remember, but I do remember that only the mourners stand for mourners Kaddish. It could be that in Sephardi that I don't know. I don't remember what the rest of the Kaddish is. Yeah, Dad.
Well, also, I mean, furthering the point that this seems to be a more on the minhag level. I mean, our conservative show pretty much on daily minyan, pretty much everybody stands. But then on Shabbat,
even if they're not mourning,
there's this little announcement. Oh, please have the mourners stand. And the mourners stand, and I'd say about a quarter or a third of the rest of the show also stands because they feel that's what they're supposed to do. And they don't listen to the rabbi.
Yeah.
Nancy.
I was just going to say, I have to heard, actually, what a rabbi I work with said, I asked him about that and why we don't all stand. And his answer, which I kind of agree with, is that if everybody stands, then we don't really know who is saying Kaddish, that to reach out to them afterwards.
Exactly, like getting right, which brings us back to our point, right, about community and what is the role of the community. So if one of the points is that the community is acknowledging the mourner and acknowledging that they're in mourning, then it can help that only the mourner stands. Maybe it's not necessary if the mourner's in any case saying it and nobody else is, you'll still notice, but it definitely helps. Like you definitely, I think symbolically it can be a helpful thing. On the other hand, you might say that like the community standing is sort of out of respect to the mourner. I don't know, I could see it going both ways, but just certainly in recognizing the mourner, I think it's helpful. Yeah, Joni.
How common or uncommon is it for the Shaliach Tzibor to be reciting the mourner's Kaddish along with the mourners?
Oh, I would think he only would recite it if there weren't mourners or if he himself was mourning.
I think my sense is that it's done to keep people from being embarrassed who don't know,
okay,
and also to sort of keep it together when there are multiple mourners.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think in most Orthodox shows that I've seen that doesn't happen, but
That makes sense too.
Sense. I can understand what you're saying, like, yeah, just to make sure that people are on the same page, and yeah. Okay, so just to wrap this up, because we do of course have lots of sources on our Kriyat Torah. So the last source we saw last week was from James Mizell. And he, first of all, he talks about what we've been saying. It reminds the community, this I didn't actually bring last time, that it reminds the mourner again and again, you are still mourning, right? It's a way for the mourner to sort of be in touch with his or her mourning every day. They say Kaddish every day. And it reminds the community again and again, your friend is still mourning, still in pain, still in loss. In other words, like, most people probably know, or not every, a lot of people probably know that the person is mourning, but every time that they get up, it's sort of a reminder, like, you know what? This person's still in their mourning period, and pay attention and be sensitive. And then the second paragraph is what we read at the end of last class, which is how sort of it's a way of, Kaddish is a way of sort of presenting yourself to the community in all of your, all of your complex emotions that go along with it. And at Kaddish, we're trying to hold all of the different complex emotions that can come along with mourning. And he also makes a connection to Kaddish as in not mourner's Kaddish, but regular Kaddish, which comes at the end of the regular full Kaddish, or even the half Kaddish that comes at the end of the parts of the services, but the full Kaddish that comes at the end of the entire service is also a way of sort of holding all the different feelings and experiences that you've gone through throughout the prayers to like expand to hold all of it. I like this source because I think it's like important to keep in mind that prayer can have space for a complexity of emotions and lots of different conflicting emotions. And just because we're in the shul and saying certain words doesn't mean that the person has to feel, a person might feel distant from God, a person might feel angry from God, a person might not feel like they're not believing in God, and like, that the prayer has room for all these different emotions like that. I think is an important thing to keep in mind. And David Kunin, who we read, we didn't get to this source last time, but we read an earlier source. He sees Kaddish, and first of all, he's talking about, a lot of what we've been talking about. We are here with you in your time of pain. We're here to provide comfort and to give you strength. He also connects it to what we had been talking about last week about Kaddish being committing ourselves as our community to acting to bring holiness into the world in all the different ways that we were discussing, through acts of loving kindness, through being a caring community. And so through saying Kaddish, we're reminding ourselves of that responsibility. And we're also sort of reminding the mourner that life, it says here, the responses are an affirmation to the mourners that life goes on, that the communal obligation for tikkun olam, that's the repair of the world, expressed in the obligations of mutual responsibility goes on. And I'll just read this ending. Kaddish, meaning holy or sanctification in Aramaic, is replete with meaning. Like the comfort provided by the prayer, holiness in the Jewish tradition is not found in isolation at some far-off ashram or hidden temple. Rather, it's most often found within community. Bringing comfort, thus expressing and recognizing our interconnection with other humans, is one means of creating a holy community. So the Kaddish sort of on one way, it recognizes how we're all interconnected and also reaffirms our joint responsibility toward tikkun olam, which are themes that I think we've seen in not only regarding the Kaddish, but in general about communal prayer and the role of communal prayer. Reminds us how we're all connected and also reminds us of our joint task in making the world a better place. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the Kriyat Torah, the public Torah reading. So like all these other different parts of the prayers that we've learned about, the Mishnah says, what does not recite, and there's a whole list of prayers, including the priestly blessing and the repetition of the Amidah that we looked at earlier in this class, but also nor do we read the Torah in public, nor does one conclude with a reading from the prophets, Haftarah, with fewer than 10. Okay, so the Torah reading that we do in Shul as a community requires 10 people. So the question becomes, why do we have to say Kriyat Torah in community? Any ideas anyone wants to throw out before we get into the sort of the history of the development of it? Why is it that Monday, right? We say Kriyat Torah Monday, Thursday, Shabbat morning, and Shabbat afternoon. So 4 times a week, we gather together to read the Torah together as a community, according to the Mishnah, only with 10 people. Any ideas like why? Why would we need to do that, and why specifically with 10 people? Why with the community? I mean, we're assuming here like 10 is like the representation of the community for our purposes.
In more modern times, it's reminiscent of when Ezra and Nehemiah brought the people back to Israel, that he gathered them all together and read the Torah to the entire people. So it's kind of a sort of a reminiscent of that.
Right. And why? In other words, why would we want to?
Because it was important for teaching the Torah that they hear the actual words. Because we learned, you're supposed to be learning Torah all the time, but for the actual reading, the repetition, they should all be standing there, kind of like how they all stood at Har Sinai when Hashem presented it through Moshe originally.
Right. Okay. So you're saying 2 different things, at least, at least 2 different things. One is that we have an obligation in general to learn Torah, right? And this is a way of learning Torah, though not. So then there's a bit of a question of why in community. Why can't we just read the Torah to each other in a chavruta of 2 people or on my own? But then you're saying something else, which is sort of a reenactment of Har Sinai, right, the original giving of the Torah, and we'll get to the Ezra and Nehemiah example, in which case there's something perhaps about the communal experience, which is more key. Anyone want to add something to that? Okay. So what we're going to do, so there in the Tanakh, right, it does not appear that there's any kind of weekly public Torah reading. Like that only appears later. Like Amy said, there are a couple times that public Torah readings are mentioned. So the first time is in Deuteronomy, and that's regarding Hakel, which happens which is a public Torah reading that happens once every 7 years. Okay, so there was a public Torah reading, but instead of being 4 times a week, it was once every 7 years. But I want to look at that source because it gives us some sort of clues in terms of what is the value of reading the Torah out loud in community. Does someone want to read the Deuteronomy source? Anyone? Yeah, Linda?
Sorry. And Moses instructed them as follows. Every 7th year, the year set for remission, Shemitah, on Sukkot, when all Israel comes to appear before your God in the place that God will choose, you shall read this Torah aloud in the presence of all Israel. Gather the people, men, women, and children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere your God and to observe faithfully every word of this Torah. Their children too, who do not know, shall hear and learn to revere your God as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross the Jordan to possess.
Okay, thanks. So according to this, what do we see about sort of the meaning of the public Torah reading? What is the point, and what are like sort of the key characteristics of it? What do we see from here?
Well, there has to be all the men, the women, and the children, and the strangers. So everyone is to be included in it. That's very important. They all should hear.
Yeah, that it's all inclusive, even children or strangers, which might be even non-Jews presumably, but who live in our community, so they're part of our community. Everybody, right? Everyone should be there. So it's something very inclusive. And why? What's the purpose ultimately?
So everybody hears the same thing at the same time, although that's not always the case. But
Okay.
theoretically, so that there can't be any misinformation or people say they didn't.
Interesting. Okay. That they
Yeah.
hear them. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And why do they need to hear it?
Because that's how they have to live their lives according to the Torah,
Yeah,
according to
right,
God's words.
exactly. Like the end goal of everybody hearing the same thing at the same time is that they observe, so they learn to revere your God and to observe faithfully every word of this Torah. And so do the children, right? It's sort of the beginning of their educational process. They don't know. It's not clear exactly not exactly clear what does that mean. They don't know. Maybe it's just that they're children. They don't know so much, or it could be that they were not, these or children that were already not on, didn't share in the experience of the giving of the Har Sinai, but they too shall hear and learn to revere your God as long as they live in the land. So we see here that it's inclusive and like that the end goal is observance, right? That if we learn this all together, we'll observe. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go.
The last line is confusing. It makes it sound that this is only asked for when people are in Israel, and if you leave, you no longer have to study the Torah, or at least do it in a group.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer. It's a good question. I don't know. I imagine that they're saying, like, as long as you're in Israel is like they weren't thinking so much about people living outside of Israel. They're about to go into Israel. They're hoping they're going to be there sort of forever, And in other words, I don't know that it was saying, and if you're not in Israel, you're not going to do it. They were saying, as you go into Israel, this is how you're going to, keep everybody committed to the Torah. But it's an interesting question.
Maybe because everyone's listening at the same time, like people hold other people accountable.
Yeah, reminding each other.
Yeah,
which is something that we've seen elsewhere also, meaning in previous classes about like what is the point of praying in community is that we can help encourage one another in our religious journey, spiritual journey, or in Tikkun Olam, right? And also in our sort of reminding each other to be better people. Yeah.
It's the other side of the question, the very excellent question that you're asked that, so if you're not there, you don't have to do it. The other side is, it says, to the children who don't know, does that mean so that the people who are living in Israel, who are secular or who haven't learned it, should really be listening to it so that they can learn it and they can do it because they're there?
Right. Yeah, I think definitely. This is.
But it also said,
even the strangers are supposed to be there. I don't even know, like a stranger, like I said, wouldn't even necessarily, it's probably not a Jewish, meaning somebody who doesn't even necessarily have the same kinds of obligations, but because, as we do in terms of the mitzvot, but as they're still part of the community, so it's interesting. So
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting that it's every 7th year it gets read, which, a lot of people are born and die in the 7 years. That's and you got to have a good memory to remember everything.
Well, I think that's why they might have decided it was not enough to do it every 7th year.
Yeah, I'm curious why they thought that from day one.
It's like the Shemitah year, so it's like you're not working, everybody can come. I don't know, but yes, it doesn't seem like it's frequent enough. And we'll see how it develops. That ends up being that ends up being weekly. Yeah, Joni.
What about the part about learning to revere God? We kind of just jumped over that. I'm not sure what's implied there, what the mechanism is supposed to be, just by, I mean, you know, we're focusing on mitzvot and laws and keeping them, but there are narratives also, and maybe that's part
Yeah.
of learning to be in awe. How do they say it? To revere. All right, well,
Yeah,
whatever.
the Hebrew,
Yeah, I
right?
saw it was yirah. Yeah, so
Like,
always hard to
yeah,
translate, but
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think
I'm
so, that it's not only about the action, but also emotional belief that somehow like you're saying, the entirety of Torah, right? Torah is not only about teaching us the mitzvot. I mean, maybe some people think it's only about teaching us the mitzvot, but there's a lot going on there. It's also helping inculcate this sort of emotional, spiritual attitude, right?
and another question I
Yeah.
have. So
Mhm.
when we're talking about the strangers, and given these are strangers who came out of Egypt or their children, with the children, with the Bnei Israel. So isn't it, I don't know if it's heresy to say this, but isn't it anachronistic to say that they don't have the same obligations at that point? I mean,
I think that they're saying once you get into Israel, because they're saying the gercha asher b'sharecha, you're the stranger in your gates. So I'm reading it. Yeah, it could be. I mean, there were non-Jews who came along, but I would assume sort of by then that they were kind of part of the Jewish people by then, you know, if they'd experienced Mount Sinai. I read it more as like, this is what you do in the future, you know.
But like how
When
far
you
into
get
the
into
future are we talking?
Israel and you have strangers in your community, they join with you.
It could
You know what
also
I'm
be
saying?
just
Mhm.
like the day after they cross. I mean, it, you know, like I don't think anything here determines what future they're
Right.
talking about.
Right. I mean, it is clearly talking about when you get into, when you get into Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think it could include others. I mean, also ger and like biblical Hebrew is a pretty broad, a broad term. But I think like one thing I would get out of it for sure is that it's the people who are more on the outskirts of the community. You know what I'm saying? Like who are not like the core community, that they too should be included. Like it's really where everybody that lives within us, with our community, they should all be included, whether it's the people who came along for the ride when we left Egypt or the strangers that live in our communities once we get to Israel, yeah. Okay. So let's go on to the Ezra and Nehemiah source. So this source is talking about after the first temple was destroyed and they're exiled to Babylon, and then they begin to come back. And one of the first things that is described in Nehemiah chapter 8 is a public Torah reading. And it seems, and we'll look at it, but it seems like it's the first time that they've read the Torah in a long time, and that there are pieces that were really forgotten over the time that they were in exile, and perhaps even before they went to exile. So does someone want to read the source in Nehemiah?
I'll read it if you want, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you.
The entire people assembled, is that what we're reading? Okay. The
Yeah.
entire people assembled as one person in the square before the water gate. Hey, we have one of those in DC. And they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the Torah of Moses with which the Lord had charged Israel. On the first day of the 7th month, Ezra, the priest, brought the Torah before the congregation, men and women, and all who could listen with understanding. He read from it, facing the square before the water gate, from the first light until midday, to the men and the woman, and those who could understand. The ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the Torah. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. Ezra opened the scroll in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people. As he opened it, all the people stood up. Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, with hands upraised. Then they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves before the Lord with their faces to the ground. Jeshua, Bani, Sherebiah, Jamin, Akub, Shabbatai, Hodiah, Masiah, Kalida, excuse my pronunciation, Azariah, Jehozabad, Hanan, Peliah, and the Levites explain the Torah to the people while the people stood in their places. They read from the scroll of the Torah of God, translating it and giving the sense so they understood the reading.
Okay, so what do we see from here that's different? What new things do we see from this public Torah reading? Specifically sort of about the nature of the reading and what's supposed to be, what's supposed to be going on.
We see
Well, now it's not just
translation.
everybody.
Yeah.
It's anybody who could understand it, and while it was being read, and they said the bracha, they said amen. While it was being read, there were people explaining it to them as it went
Right,
along.
which is a new thing, right? And did happen. We don't have it in our shuls nowadays. You can read along in the English, obviously, but for many communities did have it that they would actually have somebody translating the Torah, which sounds like what it's here. Maybe translating, maybe explaining also, right? It says translating and giving the sense. Sounds like they're translating and explaining at the same time. That that was an important part, that the people understood, right? It's not just that they're enough for them to listen to the Torah, but they really need to understand what was going on, or missed the point. Maybe it wasn't necessary in the Deuteronomy because then they understood, and now they've been in Babylonia for a long time. They don't, but we certainly, it's necessary for us nowadays also, right? Meaning we would more fall into the category of the people coming back in exile, even Israelis, I would argue, right? It's hard to understand. And then of course, like, as you alluded to, there's also the ceremony around it, right? Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered amen, amen, with hands upraised, right? There's some kind of ritual surrounding it and bowing their heads and prostrating. And they all stood up, by the way. This is the source that people some people will stand during Torah reading. This is the source. And also that the ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the Torah, right? That how do you guys understand that phrase? What is it saying there? What do you think?
Everyone was paying attention. They weren't sitting
Exactly.
and chatting.
Exactly, right, that they're focused. And this will be also brought later, right? To prove they're all supposed to be paying attention and not talking to each other. Seems like a lot of it's sort of like the repetition of the Amidah. Like there are certain times that throughout history have been like times that people times in the prayer that people take advantage to chat. And even like back in medieval sources, they felt the need to say, this is not the time to chat. You should be focusing. So yes, they should be focusing. Okay, and then Nancy, you want to finish up?
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh the gosh, Nehemiah, the Tirshut, what is that? Tirshutha? I don't know. Ezra, the priest and scribe, and the Levites who were explaining to the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. You must not mourn or weep." For all the people were weeping as they listened to the words of the Torah. Then all the people went to eat and drink and send portions and make great merriment, for they understood the things they were told.
Why were they weeping?
I assume out of, it's just so emotional, good happiness, like amazing.
Happiness. Okay, what else might it be? Right, it was very emotional to like be reading the Torah after so long. Any other? Yeah, Linda?
Or maybe they realized they hadn't been following a lot of the laws.
Right, so that's also what we're gonna see. Like they're a little, that's what we're about to see next in the next paragraph. That yes, I think also they were upset that they've been missing out on a lot of stuff. So you want to finish it up, Nancy?
Sure. On the second day, the heads of the clans of all the people and the priests and Levites gathered to Ezra the scribe to study the words of the Torah. They found written in the Torah that the Lord had commanded Moses that the Israelites must dwell in booths during the festival of the 7th month. The whole community that returned from the captivity made booths and dwelt in the booths. The Israelites had not done so from the days of Joshua, son of Nun, to that day, and there was very great rejoicing.
So in other words, I mean, this is kind of crazy. I mean, the days of Joshua ben Nun, that was right when they left, right after they first came into Israel. That since then, they had not built Sukkot, which is pretty crazy. So like I said, it's not only things that they forgot while they were in exile. It seems like there were things that they had forgotten along the way, maybe because that once every 7 years was not enough to read the Torah. Yeah, so we see here that this communal Torah reading, which was very emotional, one way or the other, right? They were all weeping, and they were focusing, and there was this whole ceremony. Also had the end effect of bringing them to
I
observe the Torah.
the beginning, but
Yeah,
wasn't it
right.
because they weren't allowed to read it on a regular basis? I missed the beginning, so.
While they were in Babylonia, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. Interesting
Mhm.
question. I'm not
Mhm.
sure, but they were certainly been allowed to read it since the days of Joshua, son of Nun. So
Mhm.
you know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? It's not
Yeah.
exactly a good enough excuse. I don't know that, meaning we see that. I mean, certainly later there's a lot of Torah learning going on in Babylonia. I don't know. I don't know that it was forbidden. Maybe I'm not sure. Okay. So those are like the two strongest examples of public Torah reading in Tanakh, but we don't see anything about it becoming instituted as a weekly practice. So where do we see that? We see that first in the Talmud. And the Talmud, interestingly, actually says that it was, first they talk about Ezra, and then in the end they say that Moses even instituted this practice. I don't know, maybe it's more likely that Ezra actually instituted it, because we certainly don't see it anywhere previously. But it would be interesting if Ezra instituted this practice, because perhaps as an inspiration, inspired by what happened when they first read the Torah, after all that time, he decided that this really needs to be a weekly thing. Okay, but so I don't know whether Moses actually instituted, or they just wanted to sort of find the rabbis wanted to find a more ancient source, to give the custom more weight. But okay, does someone want to read the Talmud source? I mean, more interesting to me is the sort of conceptual framework of why it was instituted. Anyone who hasn't?
I can do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ezra the scribe instituted 10 ordinances that communities read the Torah on Shabbat in the afternoon, and they also read the Torah on every Monday and Thursday.
Okay, so that's one of the ordinances. I mean, I didn't include all the rest, so you could say that his actual ordinance was just, this is what the sort of Gemara ends up concluding, was just the Torah on Shabbat in the afternoon. In other words, the weekly Torah reading had already been instituted, and Ezra added in Shabbat in the afternoon, in addition to the Torah on every Monday and Thursday, which was already instituted. Okay, keep going.
That community shall read the Torah on Shabbat afternoon. This ordinance was instituted due to those who sit idly on street corners.
Okay, so just to stop for a second. So there's some different interpretations of what that means. One is that it's shopkeepers who are busy during the week, but they'll come on Shabbat, including, of course, they'll come Shabbat morning too, so I don't know exactly. But I guess they want them to at least start up, meaning Shabbat afternoon is already starting the next week, so they want them to do both. And another is that people were actually just sort of hanging out on the streets on Shabbat afternoon, and like Ezra wanted to give them something meaningful to do. That's another possibility. Okay, but I'm more interested actually in the next part. So keep going.
And that they should read the Torah on every Monday and Thursday. Did Ezra institute this practice? But it was instituted from the beginning, as it is taught in a Baraita with regard to the verse. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Those who interpret verses said that water here is referring to nothing other than Torah, as it is stated, "Oh, everyone who thirsts, come for water." Since the Jews traveled for 3 days without hearing any Torah, they became weary, and therefore the prophets among them arose and instituted for them that they should read from the Torah each Shabbat and pause on Sunday and read again on Monday and pause on Tuesday and Wednesday and read again on Thursday and pause on Shabbat Eve. So they would not tarry 3 days without hearing the Torah.
Okay, so according to that, like the idea actually comes from when the Israelites were in the desert. But again, I'm not so much interested in the actual historical development as like, what does it say? What's the message here? In other words, what does this midrash come to teach us about why we do public Torah reading? How do you?
Just like water, you can't go too long without it.
Yeah, like we need it to. Yeah, you wanna. So what does that mean? Right, it's like somehow.
And to keep the community together and keep them, interested and have the sense of, the divinic aspect too, I guess.
Right. Because so that's like an interesting question. Like, is it when it said that they went 3 days without hearing any Torah, does that mean just that they didn't learn Torah as a community, or that they didn't learn any Torah, right? So maybe it's just that they didn't. So Pnina Halacha here says it's just that they learned. Presumably, like the Torah scholars among them were learning Torah, but they didn't learn Torah as a community. So like the community, like what Rose is saying, like the community needed it. They needed to learn Torah together to maintain their divinic aspect, as Rose put it, right?
Identity too, yeah.
What did you say, Rose? Their identity?
And their identity. I mean,
right. It was important for the communal identity to learn to sort of establish as a community that this is what's important to us as a community, and therefore they needed to do it.
Rachel?
Once every 3 days. Yeah.
Oh, so I learned, I don't know if it's actually true, but that Monday and Thursday were market days back then, and that's when they would have the largest number of community to try to keep that going, where there was enough people that would be the most.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I think that is true. Correct. Right. So practically, it makes sense that if we're going to have public Torah reading, it should be on those days. But they could have just had it be market days without public Torah. So, I mean, it doesn't answer it answers the question of why Mondays and Thursdays. One could look at it the way the idly on street corners, if they're already coming in the market and they're all going to be like, gossiping and whatever, they should at least do something meaningful together. But it still begs the question of why did they have to do it? Why wasn't just Shabbat enough? Why also on those days when the market, but definitely practically, yes, that's why it was.
Yeah, I mean, if the community is that important, you want to go somewhere where you're going to have the best chance of having the largest community to be there. And so it just makes total sense to do that.
Yep.
I'm curious to know if that's the reason why Torah reading is during the context of a religious service. I mean, you could just have Torah reading, like there's going to be a public reading at such and such a time, but we don't do that. We do it in the context of a service.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we're going to come back to that point. In other words, they could be two separate things. If Torah reading is not really about praying per se, but it's just something that we do as a community. Another thing we do as a community, you could say that just practically it makes sense to put them together. You're going to shul, you want to do both. Or you could say that there's some greater meaning to it, which we'll actually see later that with Rav Avi Weiss's source when we get to it at the end, that there actually is some like important religious statement in the fact that we do the two together. Meaning it's not just pragmatic. Obviously it's probably both pragmatic and have some kind of religious message. But it's a very good point. Like it's not exactly davening, right? It's like it's something a little different. It's like, why does it have to be part of davening? And I would like to say that there is a reason, that meaning that it's not just pragmatic, that it's part of our davening.
Also, the other thing is that the Monday and Thursday readings and the Shabbat afternoon readings, it's only like the very beginning of each parsha that we read. It's on Shabbat morning that we read the entire parsha with the 7 aliyahs and the maftir and everything. And when Ezra made the declaration, it was for Shabbos afternoon. Nothing was mentioned about Shabbos morning.
Right. Right. It seems like Shabbos morning is assumed, but yeah, it's an interesting point. Right, which also gets to the point of like of what the point is, meaning just reading 10 verses in terms of Torah learning, it's something, but it's not like, it's not as effective as reading the whole entire thing. There's a much longer conversation about the lengths, and also there were, at that point, there were, there was triennial verses. There were people who did the triennial also, which is still longer than the 10 verses, but shorter than what we read now on Shabbat. So that also, like, the numbers also took a while to like decide, to develop and come to our current situation where Shabbat is the entire Torah reading, and there. But the later part of this Gemara does discuss the 10 verses, the minimum of 10 verses during the week. So that definitely, came from.
Rachel?
Yeah.
I was surprised to hear you say you just assumed that Shabbat morning was there, because I was expecting that was coming next in the text when that was
really?
instituted. Yeah, so tell me more about that.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's my assumption. I haven't learned all of the context, so I don't know. But yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's a good question. When did Shabbat morning start? I think this is assuming, like, this discussion does assume that Shabbat, meaning like, look, in the continuation doesn't assume Shabbat morning was already there, but I don't know. It's a good question when
So there's
when that happened
there's
exactly.
probably a reason you assumed it. Is there something you can point to that, gave you sort of made you go in that direction of assuming that it was part of it already? Because I didn't read it that way at all.
Yeah, more just the later discussion when they're going into like the different number of verses and everything. But I haven't like learned the whole, this whole chapter in depth, so I'm not like, I don't want to say things that I don't know.
And I also wanted to ask before you get to the Penine, I just lost it on the screen.
Yeah, Penine Halacha, yeah.
Yeah, can you remind us who that is, when that was?
Yeah, so Penine Halacha, so I'm not going to, the thing I wanted to, I'm not going to read the Penine Halacha inside, but you should know, I'll tell you who he is, because anyway, it's a great.
Are you talking about Rabbi Melamed? No.
Yeah, Rabbi Melamed.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's the Penine Halacha. I'll tell you about him, even though I'm not going to read it inside, because it's a great resource to know. He basically he is currently living in Israel, but everything he wrote it in Hebrew, but it's all translated into English, and you can find it online. And he wrote just a very, very large, comprehensive work on halacha, all the different areas of halacha. And he's fairly, I mean, I assume he like lives in a Haredi community, but like he's fairly, I don't know, moderate, I feel like, in his, like, he's not too stringent. Like, I think I like learning his halacha, and it's good. I mean, I'm learning halacha now more in depth, and he's like a very good, like,
He's a Zionist Israeli person who's been in military, and he's very practical.
Very practical, very clear, very like moderate, rational, like not take things too extreme. He has some, like, in some areas of halacha, he actually has things that are a bit controversial, and they're generally more liberal. But he's still like, he's very quite orthodox. Anyway, I'm not going to read him. Why I brought him was this point that he made, which I already said. I'm not going to read it inside, but this point that he made about it being the nation. In other words, it's not that they went 3 days without anyone learning Torah, but that they didn't learn Torah as a community for 3 days. That's actually what I brought, that I thought was an important point. In other words, individuals, the Torah scholars of that generation most probably did learn Torah, but that wasn't enough. Something about the community needed to learn Torah together at least every 3 days. And that's the Penine Halacha, and I highly recommend checking him out.
Right. 10 volumes, at least 12 volumes, 15 volumes, something like that. Do you know what Tira Oat? She interpreted it in English, a few, and
she did the translation.
Yeah, and her brother, oh my God, what does he call himself? Kayam. I forgot his first name. Once they came to Israel, They were Murciano, but they came here. They call themselves, they used Rachael Tevot for their names. And he's quite an interesting person because he goes out on a limb. He told Israelis not to, follow when the government, whatever. He's just very true to himself and very transparent. So he's quite the author.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it. I want to keep going though, because I see that we only have very little time and lots of sources as usual. Okay, so the next source is from the Babylonian Talmud, and what it adds in, which is interesting in terms of thinking about why we have this weekly Torah reading, is Rav Huna Bar Yehuda said that Rabbi Ami said a person should always complete his Torah portions with the congregation during the week prior to each Shabbat. I mean, this is another sort of Jody in terms of your question of why do I assume it? Like, there definitely was an assumption that we read the whole Parsha on Shabbat. The Bible text of the weekly person twice and the translation once. In other words, that I, as an individual, during the week, need to make sure to read the whole Parsha twice and in translation once. So in other words, so here it seems like it's not only about sort of the public Torah reading, but also about the the individual learning, that like somehow reading the Torah each week, the Parsha each week will inspire me in my learning, my individual learning, to make sure that I learn that Parsha really well during that week. And many people do this. Meaning it's a nice idea. But that would be like on your own time, right? So this, I think, supports the Sefer HaChinuch. Now we're jumping ahead in time from the Talmud to Sefer HaChinuch in medieval times. So the Sefer HaChinuch what the Sefer HaChinuch does is goes through all the each parsha and says which mitzvot each parsha teaches us. So he sees the public Torah reading. He says one of the commandments is the root and principle that all lean upon, and that is Torah study. As through study, a person will know the commandments and fulfill them. And hence our sages, may their memory be blessed, fix for us to read a portion of the book of the Torah each and every week in the place of the gathering of the people, which is the synagogue, to arouse the heart of a man about the words of the Torah and the commandments until they finish the whole book. And then he goes on to talking about that we should also learn it at home so that he understands things better with his reading them at home. So for him, the point of the public Torah reading is really just to encourage us to learn Torah. In other words, it seems like the community part is more like a means to an end, right? Like if we're all there, then it reminds us, all of us, to learn Torah, but it's really ultimately about learning Torah. And it's just sort of one way of encouraging us to fulfill the key mitzvah, which is learning Torah. And for him, obviously, the learning Torah is in order to know the commandments and fulfill them. Right, that's part of his whole project of saying how each parsha teaches us different mitzvot. Okay, the Zohar, in contrast, I think I'm just going to go through these sources myself since we only have 5 more minutes. So the Zohar, in contrast, and we've touched on a lot of these things already, but the Zohar, in contrast, sees it more as a ritual, less about the learning Torah, and more as a sort of ritual communal reenactment. So he says, when the Torah reaches the bima, the people should prepare themselves with the proper awe and trembling, right? And this is, remember, very Kabbalistic, as if they were standing at Mount Sinai and about to receive the Torah. They should listen to each and every word of the Torah reading, and they have no permission to speak even words of Torah, and especially not mundane conversation. Okay? Now, you might think that if it was all about learning Torah, it would be okay to speak words of Torah during the Torah reading. But if it's more about having this sort of communal reenactment of receiving the Torah on Sinai, then you should be listening and not learning some other kind of Torah. And there's actually a dispute in the Gemara about this question of whether you can learn Torah during the Torah reading. Meaning learn some other pieces of Torah during the Torah reading. And there's all these different, there's different opinions, different explanations. One place in the Gemara it says one thing, another place it says another thing. But I think like part of why they're having this discussion is there's this question, is the Torah reading just about learning Torah, or is there something in the communal experience reenactment of receiving the Torah? Rather, they should stand there with trepidation and silence as if they have no mouth to speak. As it is written, as he opened it, all the people stood up. That's what we saw in Nehemiah, and ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the Torah, right? So we saw in Nehemiah that it was a strong communal experience. At the end of it, they wept, whether because they were happy or because they were sad that they didn't do all, they're not fulfilling all these things, but it was like a very strong emotional experience. And Rav Soloveitchik draws on the Zohar, right? Rav Soloveitchik in the 20th century, saying, public Torah reading affects the divine revelation, and whenever a person feels the presence of God, that person is obligated to sanctify the name of God and to give praise and thanks. That public Torah reading is sort of a form of experiencing divine revelation. And Rav Eliyahu Monk in Olam HaTefillah, also another modern source, says that actually that's why we read the Torah in the bima and not in the bima in the center of the shul, as opposed to the chazan at the front of the shul, because it's in the community. We're reading it. It says, God, as it were, as the King of Kings, gathers his people around his royal throne in order to tell them his will as on a festive occasion. That we're all sort of gathering around to hear God call out to us. And also Rav Dov Zinger looks at it more as sort of experiential as opposed to learning Torah. And he says it's right. He says, when we read the Torah, we are not only reading, but also calling God by name, and God calls back. During the Torah reading, we are passive. We don't say anything. We don't respond at all, only listen. From within the congregation, one rises, the Torah reader, and calls God in the name of us all, and the Holy One calls back in response. Torah reading is a time in our prayer when we stop for a moment. We cease saying our part in the prayer and listen to what the Holy Blessed One has to tell us this week. So in other words, in terms of this question of why it's part of our prayer, sort of like the complement to our prayer, right? In prayer, we're calling out to God. In the Torah reading, God is calling out to us. And this is not the time for ideas about the weekly reading. Right? We shouldn't be like reading the commentaries in our Hirsch Chumash or whatever, or for studying the Torah's commentaries. Rather, for the Torah reading, for the calling, a time for listening to divine speech bursting from the Torah, we direct our hearts to listen to the reading, to awaken, to evoke the ancient words, to transform the reading to a calling, to hear the Torah calling to us. So I want to end with Rav Avi Weiss, even though the next two sources are also great, but you can look at them yourselves. So Rav Avi Weiss talks about this question that Amy brought up of why we do tefillah and Torah together, why the public Torah reading has to be part of the prayer, part of our communal prayer. And he says that the whole point really is that our community is about, like, as a Jewish community, we're about three main things: prayer, Torah, and service, and like making the world a better place, tikkun olam, whatever you want to call it. And that all of these are enmeshed together. He calls them actually holistic tefillah, like that when we're sort of like a Heschel idea, like when we're doing good deeds, we're also praying in a sense. And that's why the prayer is sort of interspersed with Torah, including, of course, the Torah reading. And he says, I'll end with this since that is the subject. He says, one should pray with a community inspired by a mission which recognizes that prayer is an inclusive endeavor, a holistic enterprise, meshing God with Torah and good deeds. And I think this is a theme that we've seen throughout the class, how prayer is sort of not, praying with community is not only about the prayer, but it's also about sort of committing the community, committing itself to caring for one another, to making the world a better place, and also to learning Torah, which also ultimately helps us as well to make the world a better place. So thanks everybody for joining and for sharing and for all of your interesting comments. And I ran out of time, but there's lots more to learn, but this will be it for now.
Thank you.
Rachel.
Thank you,
Thank you so much
Rachel.
for this wonderful session. And thanks also for everyone who participated, is always part of our learning community. I hope to see you again soon, Rachel and everyone else. And before I wish you a happy Hanukkah, I also wanted to mention that our winter week offerings are open now. Classes include morning and afternoon sessions December 22nd through December 24th, and also a book reunion on December 25th. As always, the information, the registration links are on darisha.org/classes. And once again, I just want to thank you, Rachel, and happy Hanukkah, everyone.
I mean, thank you, Rachel. And
Thank you.